You're listening to Three Makes Baby, a podcast about fertility, family, and genetics. I'm Jana Rupnow, a fertility counselor and author of Three Makes Baby. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Three Makes Baby podcast. I have the honor today of talking with Dr. Jill Maron, who is the chief of pediatrics at Women's and Infant Hospital and a professor of pediatrics at Brown University. Dr. Jill Maron has also written numerous articles and has done a really compelling TED Talk that I highly recommend you listen to. So thank you. It is an honor to have you here today.
Thanks, Jana. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your experience. I mean, we have twofold here. We have, as a neonatologist, you have a lot of experience that has informed your sort of perspective about the application of DNA testing. And, last podcast, I had a guest on who talked about DNA testing and really feels pro DNA testing, feels positive about it, and encourages parents to do it. I really wanted to make sure that I was presenting both sides and giving people as much information as they can about DNA testing, after meeting you and talking to you about what you know. So I was just wondering, I know you had a chance to listen to that podcast, and if you have anything you would share about whether a parent should DNA test their donor conceived child at a young age in order to get more information about their genetics, especially if they've used an anonymous donor.
Sure. So just to also give some background to your listeners and viewers of the podcast, I am also donor conceived, and I found out very late in my own life. I was the age of 46 before I knew that I was donor conceived. So obviously that shook my world to a great degree, particularly being a physician myself, being conceived from a physician and the deliberate practice that was so many years ago with targeted sperm donation from medical students and physicians. And then to find myself in this space where I was taking care of babies who very often were conceived either through egg sperm donation or other means of artificial reproductive technology. And my own research interests happened to be in genetics. So I was conducting a national genetics trial when I learned my own truth via 23andMe that I was conceived in a way that I never had any knowledge of. I never knew my whole life that I was a donor conceived individual.
Yeah.
So yeah, I will say this gives me an extraordinarily somewhat very unique situation to be in the genetic space from a career standpoint in children, in babies, and what we're using these technologies for. And then in so many ways, I was one of the first genetic experiments, I felt like, as I learned about how I was conceived, where I was conceived, how my donor was selected in a very targeted manner, and came to learn much more about the practices half a century ago of what physicians were trying to do and thought they knew best of how to do it.
Yeah.
So that frames my opinion. So it's a unique one.
It is so unique. And thank you for that. I did have that down here, a nice little segue to that part that you have a deeply personal connection. And I just jumped ahead of myself, but I do want to share an article. So if you're listening out there and you want to look up an article that was written in Clinical Therapeutics in 2020 of November of 2020, The Hidden Generation: Offspring from Sperm Donation in an Era of Medical Paternalism, is written by you. And I found it so interesting and so helpful. And you talk about some of the practices that were done that is how you were also conceived by physicians in secrecy. So using fresh sperm.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, that word paternalism was deliberate, and through my own processing of what happened to me, I've had to reconcile not just what happened to me, but what my very own profession did. And you take such great pride in, I take such great pride in being a doctor, but medicine has held some pretty deep, dark secrets. And this perhaps doesn't rise to some of the level of what we have done to other communities and other populations, but this concept that physicians could sit back and determine they knew best what was for families, they knew best what was for that child, and then provide no path forward or protections in place for that child, I really struggled with. That was something that I think helped shape my view of my opinion today about how careful I really believe we need to be with genetic testing of children and really making sure we're doing everything we can to protect them in that process.
Mm-hmm. And when you say protect them, what are we protecting them from? Just for those of us that just know very, very little about this.
Sure. So I think, for most people, we think of genetic testing as these platforms, 23andMe, Ancestry.com. So you're going to pick up, where's my ancestry? Where have my, relatives come from? And then there's targeted genetic screening. So they're doing population-based screening, saying, do you have some variant in genes that we know may put you at risk for certain cancers, cardiovascular diseases, neurological diseases? And the hope is if you knew that information, you could then guide your medical care, potentially. What we know about even some of those variants, even a person with BRCA, it's never 100% you're going to get breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think it's really important for the audience to know is, in rare cases, if you have the variant, you will have the disease. But in far more, you can have the variant and it's not 100% you're going to exhibit that disease. So there's that burden of living with this process of, but I may get breast cancer, I may get ovarian cancer, I may get Alzheimer's. And so there's a burden there.
I see.
23andMe and Ancestry can risk stratify you based on population-based genetics, saying we know you have the variant, and you'll see this in 23andMe. So your likelihood of developing hypertension is 80% by the time you're 90, right? They're giving you a risk stratification, not 100% call out.
Mm-hmm.
But what a lot of people don't know is right now, especially in pediatrics, there is a huge push internationally to start using very comprehensive genomic screening practices at birth, with the hope that if we just start sequencing everyone born, we'll understand what they're at risk for. We may identify rare diseases and we will impact care, save lives, and just, extend the lifespan. And that's a theoretical concept.
Yeah.
But it carries with it enormous privacy risks, insurance risks, psychological risks to the child.
Mm-hmm.
And so being in this space, I'm torn because I write papers about how powerful these tests can be, and I write papers about how we better be careful.
Right.
So I walk on both sides of the street talking about this is a great test. It comes with enormous responsibility, and we own that responsibility.
Yeah. It reminds me, it's kind of like AI,
Sure. Yes, it is.
Similar discussions around AI. And I want to go back to what you said about the risk or the kind of the responsibility that we have if we do a DNA test on our child and how that might impact our child. Is it that, by reading these results that we're sort of trying to play geneticists, think we know something that actually we don't really fully understand as lay people, and then we're possibly putting the psychological burden of that potential health problem on our child? Is that part of it? Okay.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's part of it. It's at this stage, our understanding of the genome really is still in its infancy. And we don't know exactly what so many of these variants mean. We don't know if you actually will have that disorder or that disease later in life. So there's that burden. And, I've always taken the stance of if what you're really trying to do is identify adult onset diseases, then let them be an adult and choose to know. we even know in the adult population now, many people don't want to know that they may get X, Y, or Z later in life. It's not in their makeup to want to have that information. They may be anxiety driven. They may find that's not helpful. It may paralyze some people. So I think we have to also be respectful of that and talk about autonomy of the child in making a decision point around what they want to know about their DNA.
Okay. And then what about in the case of people who have used parents who have used an anonymous donor and have really basic and possibly untrue, inaccurate information about their child's health from the donor's side?
Yeah.
In those cases and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. It's just sort of, if I look at this, the real problem is how we have an unregulated donor system in the United States of America.
Yeah.
That's the real problem. The answer shouldn't be, if you're donor conceived, you must get a genetic test. The answer should be, if you were donor conceived, we understand the enormity of it, and we have that information for you. And you don't have 50 siblings. There's been regulation. I mean, that is, for me as a physician, that's also something I take very seriously, because I think it's absolute medical negligence, what is occurring in the donor conceived space. So I really want to make it clear that I don't think the answer should be get a genetic test. I think the answer is we have a big problem in the donor conceived space. Having said that, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States of America, which is unlike any other country that uses these practices, because every other country pretty much will regulate it except ours. And so we do have these situations where you have children out here who don't know their siblings or how many they have. There's no information about how many they have. There's no mandate to update medical records. Anyone could lie about it while they were at it. There's really no proof of anything. And of course, as we age, we may develop certain things as a donor that we didn't know at the time that we gave our DNA away. So I do understand the risks of that. I do walk a fine line of, well, is your child healthy now? Is there something you're concerned about? And I would say, if your child were having any medical condition, I am absolutely for, and not a 23andMe, full on genetic counseling, genetic sequencing, and you need to get, to the bottom of that. So the grace medical indication to me, 100%, particularly in the setting of donor conceived, because you simply don't know.
Yeah. And adoptees too, that are
correct,
possibly don't know their birth family.
Correct.
Parent. And maybe even NPEs, not, that don't know one side or the other. So this could apply not just to donor conception, but anyone who doesn't have a connection to a biological parent or person on one
absolutely
and has missing information. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I would highly recommend that, even as a physician, to say in these settings, this is a great tool. I think the gray zone for me, and I struggle with this, is you have a healthy child who's thriving and you're going fishing, and you're going to see, what are you at risk for? And as I said, most of these population-based studies at this point, it's a risk stratification. There are rare diseases out there, but it is more common that a variant may give you a disease rather than 100% it will. And so for me, unless there's a strong medical indication, I much more favor that child certainly being aware that there's this blank, history of their genes and where they came from, and helping guide them to, do you want to be tested? And let's do that if that's what you want. So that's where I've walked the fine line. And I will say part of that is also driven by the fact that I feel no one gave me a choice. Someone played with my own DNA and never gave me a voice.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And I struggle playing that forward. I really do.
I see what you're saying. And what I was thinking is that when you have missing information, when you grow up, you know you're donor conceived, you know you're adopted, and you have missing information, that having little pieces of information that are true, because so many donor conceived people and adoptee were told misinformation. So they go like their life thinking they're part Italian like me, or they're German like our Lindsay, our previous guest, and they're not. And it seems silly. It seems like, well, what does it matter? But it's weird how you do sort of, that does somehow matter. You sort of, especially as a young kid, it seems to be part of who you are, and you're trying to make sense of yourself. So, my thoughts have been, if you have some little pieces of information that are true through DNA testing that you can share with your child, is that better than a big, kind of just that missing hole? And I hear this is not an easy answer, because what you're saying is, but you feel like this was taken away from you. Your genetics were played with, and you would like to make that decision and not have your parents have made that decision for you.
Yeah. And I think, I want to be fair to the audience. That is absolutely, I'm aware that that's a driving force for me. I very much feel that my voice, I was, very much wanted, very much loved, never, ever protected. That's really how I feel. And given my own profession and having gravitated towards genetics, towards pediatrics, I feel like someone along the line should have seen me and said, oh, she really should know this truth about herself because of the woman she became. That's really valuable to her. And again, it was just silence all those years.
All those years. What broke the silence?
And I think this is another point. I was on 23andMe, and Leslie brought this up in the last interview that you had with her. I grew up thinking I was almost 100% Italian, and I look at my blonde hair and my blue eyes, and my father was, maiden name Lamanna. My grandparents were born and raised in Italy. I took such great pride in being a blonde Italian. And I'd gone on 23andMe and I wasn't Italian, but and what people could do with 23andMe is you don't have to look at your health. You could just look at your ancestry.
That's true. Okay. Yeah.
So there's a way for your child, and then you let them, the information's always there. It was just a click. So for years I was on 23andMe. I never bothered to look at my relatives or my health record, but it was my brother, my social brother who I grew up with, and he was approached by a woman who said, I'm your sister. And he said, what is going on? And I said, well, it turns out I'm on 23andMe. I could unlock my relatives and see if she's one of our sisters. And when I unlocked the relatives, I just had all of these siblings, but not his sister. And so then I knew that my parents had used donor and they had used different donors for us.
And you knew
so we were only half siblings. Because I'm a doctor and I study genetics. So the second I saw it, I knew. And I'd asked my brother who's on the phone with me, I said, what is the name of the woman who claims to be your sister? And she wasn't one of my sisters. And then I knew what they had done.
Did you tell your brother then?
He was on the phone with me.
So you were uncovering this together.
We were together. It was a rapid fire of events. I'm on the phone with him. I said, well, it's just a click away. I'll click my relatives. And then I saw sibling. And they weren't his siblings. And he has his own.
Well, and what happened next? What did you do? And that moment, was a lot of people talk about the shock that hits right away. Disorientation.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely in shock, especially at 46. And then there was a part of me that thought that's the piece that was missing. There was a part of me that said, now it all makes sense. And then there was the devastation of loss. And I think I had to go through a process of mourning who I thought I was.
Yes.
And I had to, unfortunately, my own father had passed away at that point 8 years prior, and I couldn't resolve anything with him. So that was also a big loss for me. And then I had this absolutely overwhelming sense that I had to figure out who my biological father was. I had an uneasiness to me that was hard to explain. I did not know who I had running through my whole body. I had someone's DNA, and it was so unnerving to me that I
Like
had a stranger.
stranger, a stranger. So you felt all of a sudden, what does that feel like to all of a sudden in a moment, in 1 second, not know part of you?
Yeah,
And
it was
so many
it
people,
was really hard.
so many people dismiss it and say, "Oh, what's the big deal? Your dad's still your dad. It doesn't matter. You're still you." How can we help them to understand that if they've never experienced that?
Yeah, I don't know how. I also think this whole process was so humbling for me. I mean, I've taken care of donor children before. You know, I've
Oh,
never given it the thought it deserved. And then that really made me reflect as a physician
yeah,
about the enormity of it. And I think in so many ways made me so much more protective of children that I'm charged with taking care of.
yeah.
As a neonatologist, I know my patients can't communicate with me. I've chosen a field that these are just the innocent of the innocent. But, it goes back to Dr. Seuss as a famous quote. It says, a person is a person, no matter how small. And I have that in my office, and I remind myself every day of it. Our children are people. Our babies are individuals. They're an extension of us, but they're not us.
That's right.
And they are, God willing, going to grow up and be free thinking and have their own personalities and have their own views of the world that, of course, we help shape. But you don't raise a child to be you. You raise them to be themselves and the best version of themselves. And so I really have become very, very protective of that. But not knowing who is running through me, I have to tell you, I woke up in almost a panic. And one of the very first things, besides confronting my mother that night, was I hired a genealogist. I said, I need to know now who this is.
How quickly did you find him?
I did find him.
You did. How long did
Um, it didn't take long. His weak link was his brother went on there.
Right.
And that was the weak link. And I knew, knowing enough about genetics, I even said to the genealogist, I said, it's this family, but I don't know who. Find out who. Because it was just, there were so many of them. And I was like, it's them, but I don't know who in that family it is.
Okay.
And it turned out this group, this family had several brothers, but only one doctor. And I said, that's the one. And then ultimately I was able to communicate with his brother and say, I know it's him. And he confirmed it was him, and then confirmed he didn't want anything to do with any of us. So
Did you saw a picture of him?
I had to hunt it down. I mean, the internet.
Yeah.
And he's also a pediatrician like me. And so
He-
that's been a huge struggle for me too.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Because I didn't come from a medical family at all. And I heard my whole life, why do you like medicine? Where'd you come from? What's going on? I'm really, my family would pass out at the sight of blood. And here I was, I'm going to go be a doctor. And then to choose the very specialty of my biological father.
That's it's what is to that. I think there's so many people that say that genetics don't matter, and when I hear stories like this time and time again, it's I think they do. I think they do.
Yeah,
I think there's something
they
there.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, of my siblings, and I'm actually one of my sisters, we've become much closer, and she's really been a blessing in my life, I think. And, I've talked to her about it. No one else that we know of our siblings is a physician. And so they'll always use that as well, we're not doctors. And I was like, yeah, this is a thing with DNA. When it mixes up, this is why your children are all different.
Yeah.
When it mixes up at time of conception, you inherit certain parts. And for me, every day I'm reminded what I got from him.
Yeah.
Every day I'm reminded I know what I carry of him. And that was it. I may also have some of his mannerisms, maybe some of his physical features, his habits. I don't know, but I
Mhm.
know that love of medicine is his.
Yeah.
And maybe it was been molded by my own parents, but that drive to be a doctor, I'm reminded every day what I carry of him.
And
Uh,
it's so
right.
big.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then I struggle with that. I'm thinking, God, how can you be a pediatrician and a father and have, these other donor children out there and shut them out? I feel like, did you miss something when you studied to be a pediatrician about the health of a child, the well-being of a child? I feel like of anyone, you should know
Yeah.
that how important this is to a child's identity. And we didn't do what you did.
Yeah. Have a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you then think, well, who is he personally?
Yeah.
Right? Who is he that he feels that he could have done this and then washed his hand of it as a medical physician?
Yeah. It's hard to understand.
It's hard to
That
understand.
who makes me think of what we spoke about at the beginning, which is that paternalism in medicine. That which can you explain that a little bit for those listening? Because that might be a brand new concept
Yeah.
and it's really eye-opening actually.
It's this concept, and certainly, decades ago, it was doctor knows best, right? I know what's best for you, and I'll tell you. And the newer generations of physicians, and myself included, although I don't feel I'm that new anymore, it was always the voice of the patient. What do they want? What do they feel comfortable with? What are their wishes? What are their goals for their health and for their care? It's not deciding for them. But unfortunately, even in today's day and age, right, when we talk about donor conceived children, it's the focus solely is on the parents want, whoever the parents are, single parent, a family, however that's formed, want a child.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Want a baby.
Okay. They want a baby. Okay. And the donor will do it, but don't bother him after that or her, right? Like we'll do, but no. Okay. And then you think, well, what about the child?
Mm-hmm.
What about the child?
Mm-hmm.
And I would still say, who's thinking about that? Because I'm
Yeah.
not sure anyone is.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I'm not sure anyone is.
Because they're not
And so,
realizing them yet. And, also, this is money driven too. There's a lot of money and I think it's easy for people to forget the future, not think about the future. I talk
mhm,
to parents, prospective parents every day who are just thinking about now. And that's no
right.
fault of yours. It's just hard to not, how can you know what you don't know?
Yeah.
No one's
Yeah.
telling.
And no one's telling them, and no one had the courage to play it forward. And when we have society now where we have what I would say my own generation hidden, the number of people that are starting because of these tests to realize that they were lied to, they were conceived in this manner. They have no idea how many siblings they have. There's 6 years between myself and my youngest sibling that I know of. I don't know. I literally have no idea, nor will I ever know how many siblings I have, right? That's an abyss that will never be answered. But why did any physician think that was okay? And why weren't records kept? And why wasn't that in my medical record? It is my medical record. And doctors, and I can call it out because I am one, they
Mm.
know better than that. They know better than that and chose to do it anyway. And there's where your gross medical negligence is. And that really has to be addressed. So they made the decision that who cares how many siblings that child has? Who cares what their medical risk is? Who cares that I'm not going to say anything about a false medical history that I will allow them to tell over and over and over again? And I'm embarrassed for my profession for that. It's embarrassing that we continue to do that and fail to at any point see it from the lens of a child.
Yeah. I think my guess, I don't know if you've listened to the Inconceivable Truth podcast with Matt Katz. He uncovers that he was conceived with a donor and he went and interviewed the fertility doctor at the time that
Mhm.
still around. And he asked him about these practices and, mixing sperm and telling the parents that, the donor sperm is going to help your husband's sperm. Just go home and have intercourse and don't speak about it again. And this doctor, and I can't remember his name, but he had basically convinced himself that this was okay and that there was nothing wrong with this. And even when the Matt found out that his biological father, in fact, wasn't a doctor at all, but was an actor, And the doctor had told him over and over, no, I only use medical students. And he went back to him and he said, listen, I found something different. The doctor still denied it and said, that's just not possible.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a form, I think it's really psychological methods like denial and, sort of rationalization, maybe that's being done in some cases for because I know that there's got to be doctors out there. They're not bad people, right?
They're not. No.
Yeah.
They're not bad people. It's just this failure to play it forward. It's failure to have the courage to do so. And in pediatrics, I often think our children are always last, right? They're always left behind. So this is a battle I fight constantly to advocate for the child. And, what I really want my professional colleagues to understand is that children are not things to have. They're human beings. And we have to treat them the way we would treat anyone else. And I want these technologies available for families who need them to conceive. That is not even in question. But what I want is responsible regulation of them because no child should have 50 siblings.
Right.
That is not an appropriate thing to do to a child. Yeah. And you have a responsibility when you do that and don't keep records and don't mandate that we'll regulate anything. That type of thing is happening under medical watch. Yeah. And it blows my mind that my colleagues in my profession continue to do so without really looking at it from that lens. Because I can tell you, and I don't know what your experience is, but you don't know how to process all those siblings.
That's right. That's right.
You don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, there's no construct that you can make it make sense. And you don't know, I think a lot of donor conceived people have shared that they struggle with what role am I supposed to have with this person? And I think there's an idea, some people will jump all in and go, they're my sibling. And other people will be like, they don't really feel like my sibling. They feel kind of like a stranger or like an acquaintance. So yeah, I think it's just hard to know what is the rule. And there is no rule. There is no rule. Everyone's individual and has to do what's right for them. But yeah, you're right. I mean, no one should have 50 siblings. No one should have 50 unknown siblings.
Correct. Correct.
I've heard so many cases of accidental bump-ins to half siblings or going to the same school, living on the same street, and they didn't know it. Which, if you read, the articles put out by the ASRM, except not too long ago, they would say it's a rare chance that you would have donor siblings meet or date each other. That would be rare. And I'm finding just in talking to people, I don't think it's as rare as they think it would be.
Right. Yeah. And when you think about what that could do to an individual to find out that they had whatever relationship that they didn't know about with a sibling, and that happened because of medical negligence, that doctors allowed that to happen to you because, again, not a nefarious concept of trying to help a family have a child, but an absolute lack of responsibility for how that came about and a lack of responsibility to the child. Everyone else you helped out. You told that donor they could be anonymous. You told those parents, don't worry about it. And you walked away the second you conceived, said, I will wash my hands of this and I'll do it again tomorrow with the same donor. Who cares? And no one said, but what about the child?
And you know what you said kind of goes full circle because there was a story in CNN this year that came out about a donor conceived individual, Victoria, who found out recently that her boyfriend in high school was her half brother through a donor and did not know it. They had relations. It's devastating and horrifying.
Devastating.
She was so brave to come forward. Sean Tipson, the ASRM, the spokesperson for the ASRM's answer to that was, just take a DNA. If you're donor conceived, take a DNA test. And now we come full circle to our discussion about the implications of taking a DNA test. It's not.
Yeah. It's not that simple, and that should never be the answer. And I know I read that article, and she was so brave to come out, but the response from that medical society, there are some people that should never be spokespeople, and he's one of them.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. That was damaging, very damaging and dismissive. And, back to what you're saying about how you're dealing with this in your profession, that children are thought of last. They aren't, they aren't advocated for. There's this dismissiveness around it. Like, we're the parents, we know best, we're in charge, they're kids, like they don't have agency. And I couldn't agree with you more that they are people too.
They are.
And I'm speaking about after birth. This is not about, I just want to make it really clear, this is not about pro-life, pro-choice. This has nothing to, this is, we were talking about babies. So.
Yes, no, there's nothing about that here.
Yeah.
This is really just saying, if you use these technologies, you have an enormous responsibility.
Yeah.
As a parent going in to receive DNA, you have an enormous responsibility. And as a donor, it's my opinion that you have to be accessible. You have to update your medical records, and you can only donate so many times. Done. Yeah. And until we can really force that issue, and I hope via the child, I'm working, with my own academy, the Academy of Pediatrics, who to this day has never made a statement to protect these children. And I'm very much trying to change that moving forward, because they are our children. And this is not simply the domain of obstetrics or reproductive technology. It isn't. The product of this are children, and children fall under the AAP. And I really believe it's time that the Academy of Pediatrics takes a stance and say, we're not going to do this to our children anymore. Yeah. You need to regulate this.
Yes. I love that. And just speaking to that, the implications that you see in your practice. You've worked with donor-conceived children in your practice. You have seen misidentified paternity. So you've seen this. And so this is sort of the, like you said, the looking ahead. This is to anyone listening to this that might be in the profession on the reproductive side. Here's your look ahead. And can you give us any examples or stories that, might give a clearer picture of how this impacts people, donor-conceived people, in their young lives and their parents as well?
Sure. I mean, I think, one of the things, when you're donor conceived, you know what's going to pop up on a genetic test. It's not going to be your mother or your father who were either egg or sperm donor. You know that. One of the things I've seen, unfortunately, is we do genetic tests and the report comes back and I'm looking at it, and the father who said he was the father, I can see clear as day they are not the father. And believe it or not, the field is still split on that. A lot of even genetic counselors will say we didn't see that. And a lot of the genetic reports will pretend that didn't, just say cannot make a conclusive call here.
Oh, it can.
Yeah. And so that's code for you're not the father.
So there's still some secrecy that's carried over.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, the ethical field is split on it, right? And so let's flip it. Well, why would you do that? Well, here's a mom, maybe her life could be threatened if that is right? So we have domestic abuse. Mm-hmm. We have the concept of who's going to, if financially this woman is solely dependent upon this man, right? So there are risks to that.
Yeah.
But what we have to acknowledge when we pretend we didn't see, we are complicit in a false medical history of that child. We have said, I know it's false. I'm not going to say anything that may have implications later in life, but I'm just going to let them lie to their caregivers about what their medical history is. So, this is really something that I think we can uncover when we start to do these genetic testing beyond the donors. I mean, in the general population that I really struggle with as well. How do we handle this information? My approach when I talk to families about genetic sequencing is I always get the mother alone.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah. Yes.
If you think there's any chance, if this is going to be an issue, I'm not going to not reveal it. This is your chance. Okay. And so
that's a good,
So we now say, we're just going to test the baby now. We're not going to test the parents, because often when we're trying to make a medical diagnosis, we want everyone. We want the mom, the dad, the baby. But this is the thing about these tests, and I think it's a really important point. They're really powerful, and we really do not have the luxury of picking and choosing what we want. This is where the paternalism comes in, what we want to share, right?
Wow.
So You do the test, you own the test. Who are you to pick and choose for that individual what they can and can't know about it? Who am I as a physician to say, well, I know you might get cancer later, but I'm not going to tell you? Well, if I'm really not going to do that, I better make sure it's in their medical record and that we can link that sequence to them so they have the choice. So one, they know it was done, and two, can make an informed consent. Because your flip is, I knew you had BRCA as a baby, but I decided for you, you shouldn't know that. And then at 23, you get breast cancer. And you're like, wait a second, you knew when I was born, I could have gotten breast cancer. Who are you to tell me I couldn't know? Right. These are the things this is the power of that test that I struggle with all the time. I mean, I do it, I own it. I don't have the liberty to pick and choose what it is I share about it. And I need to protect them so that they have a voice in the process and have access to it throughout their lifespan.
How do you protect in these situations? I mean, it's difficult, isn't it?
It's really difficult. So a couple things people should know, when you do something like 23andMe, it's a very targeted look at certain genes. They're targeting certain genes. When I use this as a medical test, I'm sequencing the entire genome. Okay. Mm-hmm. But I am looking at certain areas, specifically if it's medically driven. So for example, if I have a baby with a heart defect and I sequence that baby, I'm asking the computer to say, go to every area of your DNA that codes for the heart. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing it very specific because I'm looking. But in so doing, there's always a chance I'm going to find something that, oh, I didn't mean to see that. Now I've seen it. Yeah. Now what do I do with that? And so I actually just submitted a paper this morning with a colleague, Sharon Terry, who's founded Genetic Alliance. And she has really worked with communities to make sure that if you sequence a child, that sequencing belongs to that individual and can follow that individual. So that first and foremost, during childhood, parents have control over it. So they know where it is. And then as the child becomes an adult, they still have access to it and can decide what it is they want to know about it too.
Okay. That's good.
So today, we just submitted another paper that really talked about it's the child's perspective. It's from the child's lens about, well, how do you do this, right? And this is an example of really creating systems. So whether you change it to health systems, whether you move out of state, whether you change insurers, you still have access to that sequencing. It's yours. And you know it's done. It's right there for you. And you decide, okay, I'm ready. Let's open the Pandora's box. And it's a Pandora's box for all of us.
Yeah.
It just is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like I don't know why I start thinking of Marvel and the Doctor Strange and the multiple possibilities that of your future that could happen, right? It's almost like
right. Mm-hmm.
You might get a glimpse at that, but you don't know for sure what's going to happen. So
you don't.
Although if you knew that you were prone to a certain disease, maybe you would make different choices in your behavior and lifestyle to help prevent that. It's such a balancing act. So back to your story, because I think that your story and how you're so right. You have such a unique perspective and position to share knowledge about this donor conception and get the attention, especially as a physician, of other physicians. What would you say has been the hardest part in sort of I'm going to say reworking your identity or trying to figure out, who you are? What was the hardest part about that? If you could pick one thing, what would that be?
I think the hardest part for me was the sense of loss and the age at which I found out. And what that's done for me, having had my father pass away so many years before, to never have an opportunity to have a discussion about this with him and to really play over and over again some of the things he said to me, and they take on different meanings. And you don't want to replay history, but I do a lot. And that was really hard for me. It was really hard to come to grips with the fact that I don't have a full sibling. I only have half siblings. That was really difficult for me to do. I think one of the greatest opportunities, though, for me was to really take up space in the advocacy world for this. to sort of use my unique voice as a pediatrician, as a neonatologist, as a researcher, and as a donor conceived individual to say, we need to do better. This is not okay. We need to protect our children, and we need to make these practices responsible and safe to all, not some. And our children are at the center of that, and we are not protecting them. The trauma that I went through, the trauma that others are still going through right now, and to think for me that my profession did it, and I know I've said this has been very hard for me. This is, I don't know why we didn't see it, but we need to see it now. And I need to put it in their face now because, because I'm traumatized every time a new sibling comes up. I live it over again.
You live it. Yeah.
I live it over again. I am traumatized, and it'll never end because I don't know how many siblings I have. And every time another one shows up at 23andMe, I just had a new sibling in the last couple of months. And it's all traumatizing in the sense, even down to which one of us siblings are going to tell her our biological father wants nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
Right? Who's breaking that? We sort of divide and conquer. We do it in stages. Okay, she just found out. Who's telling her what we know? Who's telling her that he doesn't want anything to do with us? Who's because it's so overwhelming, and we're all middle-aged.
Yeah.
None of us are young. And so our worlds are turned upside down.
Absolutely. I've worked with donor conceived adults at this stage who find out, and, I've heard them say, like, what could have been? There's that, what might have been different if I had known? Maybe lost potential even for some.
Yeah. I never know. Sometimes I oscillate in my head. If I knew he was a doctor, would that have put an enormous amount of pressure on me to become a doctor, right? Like, I worry about that. Like, if you find out as a teenager and you're trying to figure out who you are, maybe something would have happened where I would have changed career paths. So I think about that a lot. I was pretty set in who I was when I found out at 46. And it really was just the sense of loss of who you thought you were rather than, being, I was married with my own kids and, had my career. But I know I needed help. I know I didn't get it. And I know I've been left to pick up the pieces and deal with the consequences of it. And I think that's what I want to avoid for our children. Because as much as a family wants a child, that child should never be asked to bear the burden of it.
Yeah.
And I think that if you enter that clinic to do this, you have such a responsibility to that child to help him or her. You just do. And everyone does. That doctor has to make sure that information's in his or her medical record, that we've kept good records for them. That donor has to be accessible and update his or her medical record. And those parents have to be there and help guide that child and it's never really about love. This isn't about love. And your guest before me talked about this. That isn't what this is about. But it shakes you to your core when you realize that this has happened to you and you had no one helping you through that process. No one. It's just here, and get over it. That's really what it was for me.
Is that get over it. And it's really, but it's just the foundation of who you are is cracked, and everything you built upon it is unstable. And you have to do this sort of rework. And it's, I don't think we even have good programs to help people through that. Therapy definitely can help people as they rediscover who they are, and the pieces. I say, it's like we're going to sift through these pieces and figure out what sticks, what doesn't stick anymore, what new things you want to bring in. And really, you're rebuilding your story, and it's your new narrative, and you get to make it your own now. And so, I think there's some freedom in that, but there's so much loss and grief and really destruction before you can, get to that place where you can put it all back together again.
Yeah.
And I think I remember just being an adoptee, a lot of times I would have this feeling of not knowing who I was. And a lot of times it would feel like an unraveling And I remember
Mhm.
thinking, I have a lot of resiliency because I remember my visualization for that I was pulling myself back together. And, I was literally could have this picture of myself doing that. And so I think that again, it's conceptual. It's hard to know like what are the steps? How do what is step 1 through 10 that we can need to do? It's just not like that.
Right.
It's that simple. It's much more
No.
complex. But I would say therapy for sure is a great way to help people do it. Do you have any recommendations having gone through it?
No, I mean, therapy, I never had therapy before. And I actually, it was my husband who really helped guide me here because I was sad. I had such a sadness about me. And, he was really like, you need to talk to someone. And in my head, I just kept thinking, but something sad happened to me. So I should feel sad. Like sad's an emotion and I should be allowed to feel it. And something really sad happened. So it's okay. And it wasn't until, he's like, just go talk to someone. And that was very, very helpful for me. And then knowing yourself, you alluded to it earlier, and you've had many guests on Donor Conceived. We all have a different take. All of it's normal. It is what
Yeah.
we feel. And even my own brother and I, very different takes on this. And so it is what it is. And then find what's going to help you get better. And for me, no doubt, my passion has been, okay, we can't let this go. This is not right to do to a child. And I need to figure out how we're going to guide this because, these stories that CNN's reporting on, these other stories of all of us coming out and being traumatized, the community has to listen. We are the patients, I am a patient and I'm telling you to knock it off.
Yeah.
Knock it off. It's not okay.
And, I agree. And I would say there are alternatives to anonymous donation or unknown, non-identified
Mm-hmm.
sperm donation. There are programs out there now that are they're connect. I'm counseling. I'm doing these sessions. A lot of them where the recipient parent and the donor they're meeting each other before conception, and it's very intentional. And the donor's intention is to share medical updates every year with the family and to stay in contact. So that's through Seed Scout, which
Mm-hmm.
is a program that has started, I think about 2 years ago. And we need more programs like that.
We do. We do.
Yeah.
And I think they set the example of how this can be done responsibly.
Right.
And it is uncomfortable, right? A lot of that's uncomfortable, but this is what needs to be done. You have to understand the enormity. It's like, I want people to be uncomfortable because that means they're ready to do it. But if you walk in and just think, well, I'll use it and I'm going to pretend I didn't. No, that's not a thing. Or if I think I'll just donate 50 times, that shouldn't be a thing either, right? I mean, you have to get uncomfortable and be able to say, yes, this is for me and I'm going to be there and I'm going to put the child first.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to have those hard conversations. And that's how we'll know you're in the right spot to be doing this and participating in this.
Yeah. I would say to anyone listening out there, if you have any questions from today's episode, because we covered some really good stuff. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Jana.
Oh, amazing. And so I imagine we're going to have a lot of questions. So I will, you can, reach out to me on social media. You can email me, Jana@janarupnow.com. And I talk with Dr. Maron a lot. So we stay in touch so I can pose these questions and we can explore. I think the more we can help parents out there to make the right decisions for their child, that, we can start there. And the parents can then start demanding that this be done properly, whether they're conceiving, going out to, for the first time to use a donor, or they're in the pediatrician's office trying to, make the right decision for their child's health. So what we didn't cover today, maybe for another episode, is the testing that's done, the genetic testing that's done prior to conception on donors, on parents, and kind of decisions they're making also on embryos as well. So, but we'll save that for another day because
another
that's
another big topic out there. That's right.
Yeah, that might be a little too much for one episode. So, is there anything you'd like to leave everyone with?
No, I mean, I think I pretty much covered it. I am a big proponent of child first. I think when we do that, it's really for the best. And, again, to be clear, we should have donors. We need to regulate it so that we are always thinking about having the courage to play it down the line. So when you're 50, you're okay. And
Yeah.
you're not worried about how many siblings you have.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, I will end it on that. And thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Jana. It was a pleasure. I really appreciated it.
Thanks for listening. If you would like to follow me for more content, you can find me on Instagram at Jana Rupnow, LPC, and Facebook. And you can also grab a copy of my book, 3 Makes Baby, on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and Target.com. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and rate it and share it with a friend if you like it. Have a great day.